we're just going to use this episode to discuss the murder of Tyree Nichols in Memphis. And so one of the things that Dr. Fred Eccles brought up was how there needs to be a for us by us approach to crime prevention, or really prevention of harm. But what we see is that the for us by us model has been convoluted by the criminal legal system to think that solely increasing diversity in police forces is going to enhance relationships with community and decrease victimization. But really what we find is that actually a lot of research demonstrates how increasing the number of non-white officers in a department actually doesn't have any kind of positive impact on use of force or decreased victimization. And in fact, in some places, we actually see it exasperated. And so this is kind of what we see with what happened with Nichols as well. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on the for us by us approach and how you feel like it's different from what we saw in Memphis.
I really appreciated the interview. So many things really resonated with me. I think one of the things that really resonated me, and you talked about it on the podcast, was the idea of credible messengers. And I know what we always talk about, credible messengers, people that can kind of serve as these middlemen and kind of articulate these messages of the community and kind of are balancing this role between formalized government officials like the police and the community. And why I think that's important, because when I kept hearing you say that, what kept creeped in my mind was this idea that we have to do a better job of including the community when we think about kind of like crime control. And I think that's what the for us bias was. There's an article that you had sent to me, which I thought was awesome. It was this opinion piece talking about how Tyree Nichols' tragic death happened despite police reforms, right, and act to prevent it. And they talk about the recipe for disaster kind of really happens in kind of really two big ways. One, there's been extreme pressure on law enforcement, right, from elected officials and from the community to reduce violent crime. And that's not only specific to Memphis, but in a lot of cities. And also this idea that there's a lack of kind of supervision in these units. So because violent crime is going up, police department has created these specialized units to deal with, like, they're either like called strike forces, or in this instance, they're called a scorpion unit, which we could talk about that. I was talking to a policing scholar over the weekend. It was like, when the police does this, they should call it like the teddy bear unit or something that's not, so like, aggressive. And then also once you put individuals in these specialized units, they also have the inexperience to really understand those problems. And what that was really important, because in the for us by us model, I thought you guys did a great job explaining that it has to be some shared responsibility to do this, right? And so not one entity has all the answers. And what I love about the medical approach is that, hey, we do this well. We focus on the social determinants of health. We know community. We know what the trauma-informed care literature says. This is what we do. We're not trying to step on police department's foot. And I think a lot of times we get ourselves in trouble, as you can see with a lot of unarmed shootings, is when one institution tries to do too much or assume too much in this process. And I think we have to think about what shared responsibility may mean us and what this idea of credible messengers is, and including community in these aspects.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find in my research is that cultural and contextual competence is super important for community members to feel safe engaging with anyone who's tasked to help. And so I think the issue, though, is that even if you are culturally and contextually competent, meaning you have an awareness of how the neighborhood acts and who's a part of it and who leads it and what's going on in the corners and whatever, even if you have that understanding, it's what police are tasked to do. Like, it doesn't really matter if you have that awareness. It's the criminalizing aspect and what you're describing as like scorpion or all of these like very aggressive, the terminology is important because it does connotate aggression, right? Like, these individuals are in plain clothes, plain cars, like they are outside of the bounds of what the boundaries that we've set around what policing is. They have the ability to engage in ways that are different and often problematic because they don't have that kind of oversight. And so one of the things that I thought was really important is that Dr. Eccles is talking about how violence is a disease, right? So it's a contagious disease in that your exposure to it influences your behavior. But it's not only exposure, it's setting, right? So you think about like being sick, and usually if you're stressed or run down or, all these conditions that can kind of exacerbate that illness. Whereas if you're healthy and you're drinking a lot of fluids and you're getting enough sleep, you might be able to kick that sickness right away or not even get sick. But it's these conditions that cultivate disease. And so when I was thinking about, and he's talking about it in the context of community, but I was thinking about it this morning in the context of police, right? Like if we're acknowledging that violence is part of policing, then what are the conditions that are cultivating violence in and around policing?
And I think we have to think about this. I was thinking about this when you were on the podcast about thinking about gun violence as a disease, because we just had our last conversation office hours about drug use. And so what I love about Dr. Eccles is that he was a medical doctor in the Navy, which I thought was fascinating. He worked with all these organizations in St. Louis. And then during the pandemic, he was overseeing pandemic efforts in St. Louis as well. And he was talking about how there was still a disparity and a disproportionality of people who were kind of accessing services. And I think if we think about gun violence as a disease, we often have to think of ourselves like, look at the drug problem, right? When drugs were in certain type of communities, right? We still had these same type of strike forces, and we had these kind of same type of units who were tough on drugs. But
Yeah.
when drugs kind of impacted other type of communities, as Dr. Carl was talking about, it looked at it a little bit different. And we talked about that response. And I'm wondering, as we use this kind of violence as a disease model, okay, if it's a disease, then why are we treating a disease with all of these kind of punishment-led responses? And why are we not trying to treat the disease? Well, one may say because it's affecting certain type of communities. And I wonder, maybe in the future, I don't know if we predict this, if we had I don't know, time travel machine, if it affected other communities, will we be doing more type of medical interventions to fix the problem?
Right. And I think it's more metaphorical too, where a lot of the officers that I interview talk about how they are a band-aid approach, right? They recognize that the issues that they're having to address are stemming from inequality, trauma, oppression, mental health concerns, being under-resourced. And so if you think about like, you wouldn't just slap a band-aid on cancer, right? Like you wouldn't just slap a band-aid on COVID. You would have to address the cure to actually prevent the spread. And so in the community, if we know that gun violence is the outcome of being under-resourced and high amounts of poverty and low economic opportunities, that's where like people don't think of investing in those institutions as crime prevention, but it is. And that's the reframing that we need is like, no, investing in schools is harm prevention. Investing in health services is harm prevention. Investing in job opportunities and entrepreneurship is harm prevention. But we only have harm prevention, we're blinded by the criminal legal system and its idea that we need this to prevent harm when we know that this is a reactionary institution.
And it'd be easy to sit here and beat up on police today. I think that we could do that over and over, especially as this young man has lost his life. And there've been some other details, which I don't know if come to be true, reports that maybe the police officer involved may
Had
have had
a
some connection.
girlfriend, yeah,
Yeah, which just makes things more complicated. But I think we can't let our elected officials off of the hook here. And
totally.
I think that all of what you're saying is that a lot of times the strike force units and these scorpion units, they come across because that's the easiest thing to do. And what I say to that is, you're right. Like if somebody has cancer or I always say if cancer research and Lou Gehrig disease and breast cancer, people raise money for that, and there are research centers around the world. When those numbers are down, people are still researching. When those numbers up, because they're trying to find new and new cures, and
Mhm.
the disease is permeating and changing. But it seems as though even with unarmed shootings of Black men or violence in general, when gun violence is low, we kind of don't think about it. And then once we see these really spikes in crime, we have this public fear, we have this public outcry, and the community wants an immediate response, right? To deal with the everyday pressures that they're dealing with. And one of the things we know about gun violence, and as Dr. Eccles was saying, they're really related to the social determinants of health: poverty, food deserts, education. These are not problems that you can fix overnight. And what happens is we ask the police department to fix our problems overnight. And the result, the consequence of that is that sometimes lives get lost because we're trying to do it too fast and we're trying to make this change. And so some people get subsumed under that pressure. And I think it's really important that if we're going to treat gun violence as a public health crisis, we need to have research efforts constantly going. We need to have funding that's allowing us to really understand the problems, as we still don't understand it, how we need to understand it. We also need to understand what role, as you and Dr. Eccles say, should the police play? What role should different models play? Also, we know that cure violence is not the only violence reduction strategy. You have gun group based violence introduction, which relies heavily on police departments to call people in who are doing the shootings in the area. That's been controversial from city to city. You also have these health-based or hospital-based intervention strategies where if someone is a victim of a shooting, that intervention services are taken there because they believe that's the best way to kind of intervene. And you also kind of have more of a street approach, which kind of cure violence, where you have really violence interrupters. And so we understand what models work in what context and what cities. And I love that Dr. Eccles says that, all cities may not be ready for cure violence,
Right.
right? It's working in different parts, right? And so there may be another model that works. And so we need to know really all of these particular strategies.
Yeah, one of the things that is coming up for me and thinking about the disease, so we're talking about the conditions that cultivate violence. And as you were saying, we could rag on the police all we want, but the conditions aren't just embedded within the police, right? It's social conditions that are propping up the violence in policing. So it's the fact that we still have segregation in our country. It's the fact that we are in a country that is like state by state trying to break down critical race theory or the education of Black history in schools. It's the fact that we still have racism rampant in our society. And we have media who is perpetuating the lionization of police as heroes and all of these things and crime stoppers. And I think, like it's a much bigger issue, and the conditions go beyond the police. But something else I was just thinking about was, like, if you took those men, the 5 Black officers, if you took them out of the police, and it was just like these 5 dudes, these 5 Black dudes on the corner beat and killed this other Black man, we would be framing that around trauma, right? Like, we would be thinking about, especially as criminal legal scholars, what trauma did those 5 men experience that led them to this action? And we would be trying to, I think people often conflate excusing with understanding. Like, we're not justifying that action by trying to contextualize why these individuals did this thing. And I think that there's layers, right? Like, there's layers to understanding the experience of these Black men growing up in a racist society, and then the layer of policing on top of that and the power that that's given. So we have to kind of pull apart or disentangle.
The context. We need the
Exactly.
context. I don't think for a second that these 5 officers says, you know what, we're gonna wake up, we're gonna beat somebody to death. I don't think that's a conversation. We also we have to be fair in our critique, right? If we're going to consider context, like you said, if there were just 5 random Black guys who were not cops who did this, we would have context to understand sometimes it's the places that people are situated with. So one, we have to say that these 5 police officers didn't create the Scorpion unit, right? They didn't enact legislation. Just like, I don't know, maybe they self-selected to be in there, maybe they were hand chosen, but they were in this unit. And because now they're in this unit, the unit, right, then has special assignments to do X, Y, and Z, and they were a function. Not saying that they don't have the human agency to stop or do different things. Also, you said something really important, and we have to really address the elephant in the room, is that violence is really embedded in American culture. You talk about this, start talking about the morality of the state, really this eye for an eye mentality, right? So like the state says if you kill someone as retributive, then you can receive the death penalty. We can kill you. Or in certain particular instances that you can use force or you can kill someone and during certain circumstances. And so it's really interesting that when people in the community context do it, it's like, okay, hey, what's what's going on here? And so we also have to realize that violence has become wedded in our society, and that even in some contexts, I mean, a lot of sociologists, Elijah Anderson, have studied how violence is a function of communities. That's the way of kind of getting things done and being in communities. And so we also have to address the subculture of violence and how we understand things and how we move in those particular settings as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Is just it's so deeply embedded. And when I think some people misunderstand the idea that, like, when we say, well, the state sanctions it and it's fine, this eye for an eye retributive justice, but when it's done in the community, we question it. And I think some people see that as like, shouldn't it be okay in the community? But really what we're saying there is that it should be questioned when the state does it as well, right? Like, it's not that like we should give the same kind of grace in the community to the person who murders the other person as we do the state when it murders another individual. Like, no, we need to question it all and understand that exactly what you're saying. Because the other thing too is thinking about what Dr. Eccles was saying about how violence, like when you're exposed to a certain level of violence, it becomes a learned behavior because also of the conditions of these neighborhoods too have high levels of police surveillance. And if we're acknowledging that violence is inherent in the policing state, then the exposure that these individuals are experiencing are not just the exposure of community violence, but also police violence as well.
And we also then in a lot of incarceration literature has looked at this too as well, as oftentimes people get sentenced and we say, they get what deserves when they have to do their time, but also how prison environments can be exposure to violence. And so people who are not normally been exposed to violence are in these really interesting conditions, which then may problematize the whole issue when people return back. And I think we have to realize that too, is that we have to also be cognizant of this really kind of big will that we have when we think about violence. So the state sanctions it. I mean, how many times we hear these things, right? Don't drop the soap, right? We prison, people getting shanked in prison, right? We see it in kind of pop culture, also with kind of scared straight programs, right? This idea that we have to address this culture of violence. And then one thing to kind of understand, there are alternative models, right, to then understand how we may then reduce violence that is not kind of enacting violence or exhibit more punishments.
Yeah, the scared straight thing is so wild to me that we're like, this place is so bad that you don't want to end up here. Like, and I think people will think like, well, that's the whole point. Like, you want to deter people from engaging in harm because then the punishment of prison will be so bad. But we know that the punishment shouldn't be the experience of prison. It's just the loss of freedom. And also, if that were true, if deterrence was actually real, then America, having the most incarcerated people, would have no crime, right? Like, would have no violence. But we know that the harms of prison are not enough to deter people because of the conditions that they're put in. And so And the thing that's so interesting is like society's pretty on the same page when it comes to prisons. Like most people are like, yeah, prisons are fucked up. And like even the shows about prisons, like the correctional officers are often like the ones that are shady and corrupt. And the like there's this kind of general understanding that we need to change or abolish or whatever, move away from prisons because they're problematic. But when it comes to police, it's so dramatically different, even though it's part of the same system. And I don't really understand why we have latched so tightly to the idea of needing police when we know that the risk of having police is probably higher than the risk of trying something that could be better.
And I think one of the things, as it was clear with Dr. Eccles and this model that he has, and he was saying, oh, I said you that Phoenix didn't have a cure violence model. I think there's a different conversation that we've got comfortable with just saying, police, hey, just do this. Because to address those social determinants, right, would be really difficult. And we'll talk about this later because you have to have a new metric of what success may mean. And so when politicians run, right, when they're running, they either the crime rate was up during their tenure or what it was down, right? Either they were getting criminals off the street or people were running rampant. And so sometimes with these easy metrics around recidivism and crime, it's easy to hang your hat on something. And also those social determinants is, obviously you can't solve poverty in 4 years or 2 years when a political term is. So how do you determine whether you've done a good job? Or, the school system, is very difficult. There are different needs. That's not a problem you can solve in a 2-year term. Either, elected officials are 2-year or 4-year terms. That's something you can solve in 2 or 4 years. People have food. And so I think we have to, if we want things to change, we always talk about changing the incentive structure for police and changing the incentive structure for criminal justice, when really this is not really a criminal justice issue. We have to change the incentive structure for nonprofits and change the incentive structure for policymakers and change the incentive structures for philanthropists who, think about these things, all of these issues, which is a society problem, but we kind of get subsumed in it because when things don't go well, we know where people are, where they're going.
Right. Yeah. No, the idea of like reinventing the wheel and just continuing to invest and reform police, like one of the things that people are bringing up that I think is a great point is like these officers had body cameras, they had enhanced training, like they had all of these reform efforts that we've attempted to implement to decrease violence by officers, and we see that that doesn't change it, right? And so what is it like if you have policing, the criminal legal system as a whole in America was largely born out of slavery, right?
Yeah.
It was a way to lease in freed individuals back to plantation owners. It was a way to create a social caste system, a social hierarchy by policing Black bodies through the Black codes and vagrancy laws. And so when we know that it's essentially just a reiteration of slavery, like that's why I think we evoke the concept of abolition with the criminal legal system, because it's so deeply embedded with slavery. But one of the issues when we think about the abolition of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation, what that was simply the swipe of a pen. There was no shift in cultural perceptions of Black individuals. There were no safety guards put in place for individuals who were newly freed to thrive and have some sense of ownership over their home or their space or their bodies. And so because there was no cultural shift and there was just this policy shift, we've just seen it kind of snowball and be reiterated through different labels, different institutions. And so the abolition of the criminal legal system is the abolition of slavery, right? It is the abolition of inequality and oppression and trauma, but we also need to do that in a way where the conditions that we're talking about that breed violence are addressed. So it's not just we need to get rid of police, we need to get rid of prisons, we need to get rid of the courts. It's we need to do that. Yes, that should be the end goal. But to get there, we need to invest in the conditions that are cultivating problematic and harmful behaviors.
And I think abolition is becomes really important because, like you said, that cultural shift, that policy shift. But there's been countless instances where the criminal justice system, criminal legal system has been wrong. And then we have not made a cultural or a policy shift.
Right.
I think one of the things is Hillary Clinton, when she ran for president, there was a clip that was running, and all of the policymakers, one by one, was supporting the predator, super predator. And I think Joe Biden even was a little controversial. Everybody was like, yes, 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 yes. That was built off faulty evidence that we know.
Yep.
There was no acknowledgement. There was no cultural shift, and there was no policy shift, because those policies that were created under that faulty research and even that faulty pretense, they're still on the books. This idea of even the way we think about crack cocaine use, faulty research, also the war that was funding communism, movies out. Gary Webb, I think, wrote a book called The Dark Alliance. I might be mispronouncing, but he was a reporter who
Yep.
reported on the right. We got that wrong, and there was no culture shift or policy shift. And so it begs the question now that the foundation that what we stand on is very shaky, right? And then we have to kind of think about these things. So when we have gotten these things wrong, there's no policy shift. And so I think even that's why the reformist movement, because people, that's kind of like a very band-aid approach. But we have to ask ourselves, even though the people who are dying currently may not look like us or come from the socioeconomic status, when are we going to respond and say enough is enough for a system that is supposed to protect you, that we give up certain social liberties and we enter into a social contract for our government to provide us? And because we have those liberties, even the founding fathers, the founders of the classical school movement, said that people should not be dying in the streets, right? The whole founders of criminologists came up with criminology because people were being tortured, and there was barbaric treatment because the church was in, they could just say, hey, burn you at the stake or whatever. And they said people shouldn't be tortured. We shouldn't be living like this. That says something else about a society. We want to have a society where there are fair laws, where people get fair punishments. And so we have to think critically about what that means now, given this interest. And it's bigger than a black or white thing, right? Because we see black officers doing it, we see white officers doing it. And so that begs the question too, right? Like, when we think about abolition, is that there's no, oh, this is just white cops being, racist. It's like, no, there's a system set in place where anybody, you and I, if probably we were in a Scorpion unit, probably could fall prey to that system too, as well as individuals who find themselves in communities or environments that don't have particularly strong social structures. I think we should get into maybe our deep dive,
Yeah.
which I'm excited about, because some of this can seem very nihilistic, hopeless. What can we do? How can we get further? There's an op-ed article that was written just last year, which I think is really interesting, to talk about what are some solutions that we could have moving forward, and how do we think about charting a new path. That's what I love, solutions. I think we have to think about how do we chart that path forward. So somebody we both probably are familiar with, Dr. Katarina Roman, and her husband, Katarina, is a professor in the criminal justice department at Temple University, well known and respected in gun violence and community-based solution. Her husband, John K. Roman, who is a senior fellow in economics, justice, and society at the University of Chicago, penned this article. Philadelphia, which is indicative of major major cities, have seen a new record for homicides and spikes in homicide. And they write this op-ed that said the mayor should create a cabinet of experts to stem gun violence, right? Solving gun violence in Philadelphia means focusing on well-being, including investing in neighborhoods, fixing school infrastructure, and training lifeguards. And so while Philadelphia saw this increase in homicide, they said to stop this epidemic, right? City leaders, they're kind of supporting programs like Cure Violence and community crisis intervention, right? But that's kind of really narrowly addressed. And right, and so to permanently end gun violence, the mayor should create a cabinet, and they said call it, Office of Wellbeing and Opportunity, which you talked about, you and Dr. Eggers talk about, that has a high level administrative member from each government department. And the closest parallel at the federal level would be an interagency working group. And this cabinet would define gun violence as a broad public health and safety issues, one that is caused in large part by poverty and intersects with everything from education to child welfare and housing. The cabinet would be specifically tasked with identifying and directly addressing the conditions in which gun violence thrives at the neighborhood level. In this way, it will be more accountable to the well-being and safety of its residents. More important, make the office permanent, and the cabinet should outlast the individuals. Basically, the article is saying that because gun violence is a multi-dimensional problem, we've been too narrowly focusing on the rate of shootings and kind of really nothing else. So we have to really kind of understand these nuances. And I like this one quote that they say here is that the failure of policy and program on gun violence to date is that the solutions have not been as big as the problems they seek to solve.
Yeah.
A lot of lot of tidbits, but I'll let you chime in on just that kind of handful of, do you think this could work? I really like this idea of an Office of Wellbeing. Gun violence is a multidimensional problem. Do we need an office like this? Could something like this work?
I definitely think something like this could work. I mean, I think, we've failed so hard with the criminal legal system that our fear of failure should not deter us from trying something like this, right? Like our baseline is real low right now. So it only can, in my opinion, go up if we're actually addressing the root issues. And so I think that that's an important point, is like, we have a culture, especially in America, that really fears failure or fear of admission to failure. This is important because a lot of people are reinventing the wheel because we're not talking about our failures. We're not saying, "Oh, but I already tried that and it didn't work." Right? We're not admitting that. And so that's part of our cultural issue as a society, is like, we need to talk about when it's a failure, because that will help us in the future do something different. And so if we can admit as a society that we are failing, our criminal legal system is failing to deter harm. Now, some people may say, well, it's not failing to do what it was intended to do, which is create a racial hierarchy and to be oppressive, sure. But if we are stating explicitly that the intention of the criminal legal system is to decrease harm and violence and to enhance public safety, we're failing at that. It's failing at that, straight up. Like, I don't know who can say that it's not, if we are meeting record numbers of homicides in these cities like Philadelphia, as the article stated. So if we can just be curious and create this new cabinet, I don't see the harm, because the harm is already so vast in this other thing that, like, but it would have to be well informed. Because I think one of the issues is that we often see these jumps to different, body cams. That's the like immediate thing. And harsh sentencing, that's like the immediate reaction, even though it's coming from a progressive and liberal entity. And so we have to think of, what are the implications here, and is there anything that could potentially be problematic? And that's where you need to see more diversity and the inclusion of individuals' different experiences in those decision-making spaces.
Again, this is really not a criminal justice problem, right? You can create a strike force or a task force, or even things that will like stop and frisk and all of these measures to try to attempt at or try to weed out or deter or figure out who the bad guys are, or we could realize that in certain level of communities, there are different issues that already persist, kind of seeing what's going on there, but matching individuals to services. And I think that's really important too. So what are those solutions, or what are those uh, success points, and how do we incorporate those particular issues? And I think because the success often comes from the criminal justice system. That's why we're looped in these systems, right? Crime rate, shootings, and all these issues. Like, no, that should be some indicator, but there also are other indicators, like how many people are living a good life, how many people feel as though they have good mental health, right? How many people feel like they earn a living wage to raise their family? How many people can afford where they live at? And I think those are things that we have to then question, right? Because if we just look at shooting numbers, or we're just looking at recidivist numbers, they only can tell us so much, that this person shot this person. And maybe we could speculate, or this person was just rearrested. It doesn't say, why they were rearrested, or this person is experiencing this type of, or crime went up this year, or crime went down. And we still can't understand. We have some inclinations about it, but I mean, that was really the big thing of the whole super predator debate. We saw this really this increase, and people tried to guess what it was. They were wrong. And then we saw this sharp decrease, and people were just like, I guess it just went away. And, you know, I guess we can go on now. And so we know we're going to have these ebbs and flows and violence, and we kind of let these things happen, but we haven't really done our due diligence to really understand why we see these spikes.
Yeah,
And
I was thinking as you were talking, I was just thinking like, if we could frame like high crime neighborhoods, if we could frame that as high need neighborhoods, right? Like rather than viewing someone's action as just the, response of being a criminal, we can understand that every action is a reaction to something else. And so if that's the case, then every harmful act, what is it reacting to? What if that was what we explored, rather than attempting to criminalize the individual? If we contextualized the individual, right? Like rather than criminalize, let's contextualize, because that'll get us closer to preventative measures. If we know that deterring individuals solely through incarceration doesn't actually have an impact on rates of harm in these communities, then let's try to contextualize it. And I think that that's the same with these officers. Like we need to contextualize their actions beyond just viewing and criminalizing them as bad apples. We need to understand what led to this kind of behavior.
I think that's what a lot of people, we think about abolition, and you think about, or even reform efforts for that, or you think about any type of change that, when we talk about change, it just kind of makes you like, oh, that's a crazy person. You can't do that. But as soon as something happens, it's like we can do it. Like
Right.
when the pandemic happened, it was like we're no longer going to be, looking at low level offenses, or I think it was like it wasn't a moratorium on crime. People thought it was, but they were like, we're going to have kind of more of a relaxed
Yeah.
atmosphere. It was like, okay, that's interesting, right? Like, so we do have the power to do it, right? It's just that we just have to make up in our minds to do so.
Yeah. So I think we should answer the question from an audience member. Let me pull it up. So this individual asked, cure violence sounds like a great idea, but can it actually work? Which is like a basic question. I think we kind of addressed that.
I think
I
it's a good thing to talk about, but I think you should go ahead and.
Well, I think it can work if it's also like cure violence when it is solely trying to address gun violence by like interrupting and engaging in the community in a way that's trying to just deter the violent incident. That's when it doesn't really work. It has to be, because that's essentially what police are doing to some degree. And so what needs to happen is that service provision. It has to be holistic. It has to really lean into its public health foundation and take that approach of, okay, we're not just trying to interrupt violence, although yes, that needs to happen. In addition, we need to make sure that individuals in the community, not only those who are most vulnerable or engaging the most in harmful behavior, but everyone in that community who is impacted by violence has the services that they need. And that's not just accessing services, right? Like, if we're again pulling back those layers, we have to engage in a discussion on why those services weren't there in the first place, right? Like, where were those services before, as you're saying, there was the blow up, the big need? They should have been there, and we need to talk about why they're not there. And what does that say about our society and who we think deserves services, or who is advocating, who feels that they have the political power to advocate for those services in their community and be heard.
What I think Cure Violence is getting right in this direction is that I like the sustainability aspect of the model,
Yeah.
especially with the credible messengers. Is how do you get a group of people to solve problems? How do you get a group of people to work things out? That's what we're really trying to get. We're trying to make sure that in each community, that every community has the ability to work through and solve its own problems outside of police. And that's not even a crazy idea. I mean, we've been talking about that in criminal justice for years, this idea of collective efficacy, these things of, we can think about the neighborhoods that we grow up. The reason why they are so great is, and we don't see so much crime in certain neighborhoods, is because the neighborhood school, is probably good and the neighbors look out for one another. And I think what Cure Violence tries to do with those credible messengers is try to mitigate any kind of conflict that happened. I think, and one of the things that we just have to think about critically outside of police and Cure Violence is that we want the community to get to a place where they can do this for themselves. And I think that's what's really important. And we have to think through how we may do that for communities where that may be non-existence, or things are put in place where it's really hard to then have a shared responsibility for that particular place in that aspect.
Yeah. I was just thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about my partner who has 2 kids, and there's a school literally on the corner of our of the block. And it's not a great high school. It's a high school. It's not a great one. And his perspective has mostly been like, well, that's not a great school, so I'm going to put them in another school. And I think people who have the privilege to do that don't often advocate, like, rather than, and a lot of parents do this, right? Like, rather than advocating to change the conditions of their local school, they're just like, ooh, that's a bad school, let's go with another one. Right? And so people accept that shit. Like, people accept that there are bad schools. They acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And yet we let it happen. We let it ride.
Yeah.
You know? Okay, I think we've given them enough to chew on. Well, thank you all so much for joining us in episode 3 of Office Hours with Abbie and Juwan. If you enjoyed this conversation, please join us and be part of the discussion in the comments, and send any feedback to ccofficehours@gmail.com. Subscribe, like, share with everyone you know, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.